Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to try and answer a question that people often send in my direction. And it's this: when you've written a melody, well, how do we know which notes we're actually harmonizing? In other words, are we trying to find a chord for every single note of the melody? Or are we just trying to find one chord that fits loads of notes in the melody? Or what else do we need to think about? Because essentially, when you're harmonizing a melody, you will have a mixture of chord tones and non-chord tones, or what you might know as harmony notes and inessential notes. So what's the difference between those two things? Well, first of all, a chord tone or a harmony note is a note in the melody that is a member of the chord you're using. So if I use a G major chord, G, B, D, and one of the notes of my melody is G or B or D, then I'm using a harmony note or a chord tone. But if I've got a G major chord and I'm using some other note, like A, for example, well, that's a non-chord tone or an inessential note. But you can't just randomly throw notes in that don't belong to the chord just for the fun of it. There are different ways in which you can do that by extending the chord so it becomes the 7th, the 9th, 11th, the 13th. But also we've got these things called passing notes or passing tones. In other words, they're notes that don't belong to the chord, they're non-chord tones or inessential notes that pass by step between notes that do belong to the chord. So I could put my G major chord down and I could go B, A, G in the melody just over that G major chord. How does that work? Well, B belongs to the chord, A is a passing note or a passing tone, and G belongs to the chord again. So that A is going by step between a couple of notes that do belong to the chord. So that's a perfectly legitimate thing to do, to use one of those passing notes or passing tones. It can go up, it can go down, as long as it's moving by step. Well, you could do something like use a neighbour tone. So I put my G major chord down and I do something like this: G, A, G. Well, because G belongs to the chord, A is one above something that belongs to the chord but doesn't itself belong to the chord, and then we come back to G, then that A is what we call an upper neighbour tone or an upper auxiliary note. We could, of course, have a lower neighbour tone or a lower auxiliary note. So if I'm in the key of G major, I might go G, F sharp, G, and the F sharp would be a lower neighbour tone or a lower auxiliary note. I could do the same thing with other notes of the chord. So B is another note of the chord. So C, B, C, or B, A, B, or D, E, D, or D, C, D. Now there are other things we can use, like anticipatory notes, where we just anticipate a note of the next chord. So that's perfectly feasible to do. You've got things like escape notes, where you kind of fall a third and rise a note, or do that the other way around. But most of these non-chord tones or inessential notes are likely to be passing notes or passing tones, or they're going to be auxiliary notes or neighbour tones. So just to kind of work through an example of what this is all about, have a look at the melody we've got in front of us. Here's the melody. Now you could decide you're going to treat every single one of those notes as a chord tone, as a harmony note, and then you could find a chord that fits every single note. Well, that's perfectly possible. But are you happy with that? It sounds a little bit as like we're having these kind of chords thrown at us very quickly, aren't we? And it doesn't kind of make for a very kind of calm atmosphere. So if you want to have something that's much more agitated, well, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. On the other hand, you might think, well, I don't want to have many chords at all. Maybe I could just have a G major chord for the whole tune. while, you know, we can hear that melody, but the chord life of that is just incredibly boring, isn't it? Just to have one chord sitting there for the whole time. So now we get into something called harmonic rhythm. That means how often do we change the chords? And if you've got a piece of music, a melody that you're wanting to harmonize, and you're sort of thinking, well, this one, for example, is full of quavers or eighth notes, do we really want to be changing chords every single eighth note, every single quaver? Because it's going to make it sound a bit manic. So this is where we start to think, okay, well, we're in the key of G major. Well, probably we're going to start with chord 1 or a chord of G. That kind of makes sense. But then we could say, well, this could be, I'm not saying it has to be, but it could be a passing note or a passing tone, which means the next note is B. Okay, well, A qualifies as a passing note or a passing tone because it's going by step between G and B. Does it mean we have to stick with chord 1 when we get to the B? No, we could do. So if you want to stick with chord 1, you could, but you could change the chord. For example, you could decide you're going to change to chord 6, have an E minor chord. So I could do this and have an E minor chord there. I could equally stick with the original chord 1, the G major chord. So we could do that. Okay, I then could say, well, maybe the C could be another passing note or a passing tone. You see what this is doing? It's slowing down the harmonic rhythm successfully. So then I could say, well, I'll move to a new chord here and I've got D. So why don't I have a chord 5 and call it a D major chord? Because that's a D F sharp A chord, fits with the D very nicely. And you can also see that in the melody, it's going D, E, D. So in that case, this E then becomes an example of what we were talking about, one of these upper auxiliary notes or upper neighbour tones. And again, I could stick with that same chord for the second half of that bar, the second half of that measure, or I could say, well, let's change to a different chord. So maybe I could go back to a chord 1. In fact, I might even put it in first inversion, call it a 1B or a 1/6. So that would be a G/B chord. So in the first measure, the first bar, I've got a number of options. I could, for example, say the whole bar is going to be one chord, G major. Can I justify that? Absolutely. Chord tone, non-chord tone, chord tone, non-chord tone, chord tone, non-chord tone, chord tone. So that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Am I wanting one chord for the whole of that bar, the whole of that measure? If I really want to have a focus on the melody and I don't want anyone to be distracted listening to changing chords, perfectly reasonable to do that. It's kind of possibly a little bit boring. I could take a sort of halfway measure. I could say the first half of that bar, the first half of that measure is going to be a G major chord, a chord 1, and the second half is going to be a D major chord, chord 5. So it could go like this. That would be a useful halfway measure. Or we could do what I've just suggested here, where we have 4 different chords in that bar, in that measure. So you can see you've got choices to make, and these are artistic decisions. It's not that one of those is better than another. It's kind of what's the mood you're trying to create. Do you want the harmonic rhythm moving along? Do you want it to be pretty static? Do you want something in between? As long as you can deal with your melody notes in this way, it kind of brings some systematic approach to it, which is going to be very helpful. Okay, well, where could we go next? Well, we could then decide in this next bar, this next measure, we're going to go for a chord 4, which is a C major chord. And we could decide that this B here is going to be a passing note or a passing tone. And then I need a cadence because I've got the last 2 chords coming up. So I might decide I'm going to go 5 followed by 1. So that's a D chord followed by a G chord. And then you might be saying, yeah, but what's going on? Because on this chord 5, there are still 2 notes in the melody. And the second note is jumping after the first note. So what kind of non-chord tone is that? Well, the answer is it isn't really, but it's adding a seventh to chord 5. So if I've got chord 5, D, F sharp, A, I can add a seventh to it. And it's often a device that composers use. You start with an ordinary chord 5, a D major chord in this case. You add a seventh to it to enrich it before you go on. So that second bar, that second measure now goes like this. So you see how that works. It's not the only possibility. I mean, the first 4 quavers or eighth notes all fit with a chord 2. So harmony, passing, harmony, harmony. The only thing about that is it doesn't really give you a defined cadence. Going 2 to 1 is not a recognized cadence. So if that's worrying you at all, you're probably better to do something like this. You could treat the whole of the first half of that second bar, that second measure, as a 5/7. So various options arise, and it's a kind of all to do with what we're talking about, but it still leaves you with different choices on when you change chords, which chords you use. But it's still coming back to the fundamental question of, have you addressed what's a chord tone, what's a non-chord tone? Because if you've got notes lurking around that are neither of those things, that's probably where things aren't going to be so successful. So you could, at one level, have the whole piece as a single chorded G. Okay, seems pretty boring, kind of pretty tedious, and actually this corner doesn't fit with it terribly well. Maybe you could have a chord of G all the way through there, then you could use a 5/7 and come back to a chord of G. How's that go? You might think, yeah, I'm quite happy with that actually. Maybe you could start with a chord 1, go to a chord 5, and then a 5/7. That sounds perfectly nice as well, but we're just changing chords every half bar there, every half measure. If you want something to be a bit more mobile with a harmony, well, you could do what I've just suggested. So what does all that sound like? So my point here is that you've always got choices to make about harmonic rhythm, how frequently to change chords, but it's worth looking at any melody you put together and thinking, okay, which of these are chord tones, which of these are non-chord tones or harmony notes and inessential notes, and then make your decisions on the back of all that in terms of how fast or how slow you want your harmonic rhythm to be to assist the emotional mood of the piece that you're writing. So I hope that's helpful in clarifying, well, what makes a non-chord tone? How do we know which of these are chord tones and which of these are non-chord tones? Well, if you've enjoyed this video, let me invite you to take a journey around the Music Matters website. It's www.mmcourses.co.uk. And in particular, in relation to this video, I'm going to recommend our Advanced Music Theory course because it's addressing the kind of issues that we've raised in this video and then going much further with it. So all this thing about how to harmonize melodies, how to deal with these chord tones and non-chord tones, which kind of chords could be used, what are the diatonic chords, what are the extended chords, what are the chromatic chords, how do we see these in a piece of musical analysis, how do we harmonize a melody, how do we put a melody on top of some harmony, how do we deal with all this stuff in various different styles. So that would be a really good follow-on from this. It's the Advanced Music Theory course at www.mmcourses.co.uk.